She crossed half the country on a promise written in ink and stepped off the train into silence. No man, no wagon, no future waiting, just wind cutting across an empty platform and the slow, sickening realization that every beautiful word and every letter she'd kept pressed against her chest had been a lie. Eliza Hartwell had gambled everything on a stranger's handwriting and lost. But what she didn't know, standing alone in the dust of Red Creek, Montana, was that the greatest betrayal of her life was about to become the door to something she never could have chosen for herself. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like, and stay with me until the end, because this one is worth it. The train slowed like it was reluctant to stop. Eliza noticed that, the way the locomotive seemed to drag its feet, groaning and hissing steam as the brakes caught, as though even the machine understood that Red Creek, Montana was not a destination worth hurrying toward. She'd been sitting upright for the last 40 minutes, bag clutched in her lap, watching the landscape outside the window change from rolling grassland to a harder, drier country where the earth looked like it had been wrung out and left in the sun. The mountains in the distance were real enough, purple and cold and enormous against a white October sky. But everything between her and them felt like the edge of the world. Not the romantic edge, the actual one. The kind where things fell off and were not recovered. She pressed her fingers against the window glass. Cold. Already cold, and it wasn't yet noon. Red Creek, the conductor called, moving through the car with his punch already in hand. Next stop, Red Creek, 5 minutes. The woman in the seat across from Eliza, a stout lady traveling to visit her sister in Billings, glanced at her with the particular expression people wore when they were deciding whether to offer unsolicited sympathy. "You meeting family?" she asked. Eliza paused. What exactly was the word for it? Someone who was expecting me. The woman nodded as though that were a perfectly sufficient answer and returned to her knitting. Eliza turned back to the window. She had rehearsed this moment so many times in her head that it had become almost mythological. The train pulling in. The platform. His face, which she had never actually seen because they had never actually met, somehow recognizable anyway. A man who kept his word. A man whose letters ran to 4 pages because he had so much to say and so little patience for getting to the end of them. A man who wrote things like, "I am not a man of poetry, Miss Hartwell, but I find that when I sit down to write to you, something in me reaches for words I didn't know I had." She had read that sentence so many times the paper was soft at the fold. Cornelius Aldridge. That was his name. A rancher, he told her. 37 years old, widowed 2 winters back. Land outside Red Creek that had good bones, he said, but needed a woman who wasn't afraid of work or of weather. He'd found her through a correspondence agency in Boston, one of the reputable ones, at least theoretically reputable, and their letters had begun 8 months ago and had not stopped since. He'd sent her train fare in March. She hadn't used it until September because her mother had been sick, and then because she'd needed to be sure, not of him exactly, but of herself. Of whether she was the kind of woman who could do this, who could fold herself into a life that had been built without her, in a place she'd never seen, with a man whose face existed only in her imagination. By September, she had decided she was. Her mother recovered. The factory where Eliza had worked for 3 years, inspecting stitching on men's dress shirts, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a room that smelled of machine oil and other people's ambition, had made the decision easier by cutting her shift hours without cutting her rent. She'd put in her notice on a Thursday morning and been on a train to Montana by the following Tuesday. She had not let herself look back through the window as the station disappeared. Now the train was slowing into Red Creek, and Eliza smoothed her skirt with both hands, because she needed something to do with them, and then lifted her bag from her lap and turned to face the aisle. The conductor opened the door at the far end of the car. A wash of cold mountain air moved through, smelling of pine and dirt and something else she couldn't name, something dry and mineral that seemed specific to this part of the world, as though the earth here had its own particular scent that it had been working on for a long time. She stood, gathered herself, walked toward the door. The platform at Red Creek was a single long strip of weathered pine boards running alongside the track. There was a station building, more of a shed really, with a stovepipe coming out of one end and a hand-lettered sign above the door that said, "Station Master," and 3 wooden benches, and a water trough at the far end that had a thin skin of ice along one edge. And that was it. Eliza stepped off the train and stood on the platform and looked. There were perhaps a dozen people milling about. A family loading crates into the back of a wagon. 2 cowboys who'd gotten off 2 stops back and seemed annoyed to still be here. A woman in a heavy black coat watching the train with the specific expression of someone waiting for bad news to arrive in human form. No Cornelius Aldridge. Eliza moved away from the steps to let others disembark, and she stood with her trunk at her feet and her bag on her shoulder, and she looked at each face on the platform with the careful patience of someone who had prepared for this possibility and told herself it was fine. He was late. Men were late. Ranchers especially, she'd gathered from his letters, lived by the clock of their animals rather than any timepiece. A cow didn't care that the train arrived at 11:45. A stuck fence post didn't reorganize itself around a scheduled arrival. She would wait. She waited. 20 minutes passed. The train pulled out. The family with the wagon drove away, and the woman in black was met by a man who did not look like bad news after all, and the 2 cowboys wandered off toward the building at the end of the main street that had a sign she could just barely make out from here. Saloon, naturally. And the platform emptied until it was only Eliza and the station master, a thin man in his 50s with a mustache that seemed to be carrying too much weight for his face. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, coming out with a broom he didn't appear to actually intend to use. "Yes," she said. "Cornelius Aldridge. Do you know him?" The station master's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. The way a man's face moves when he's deciding how much of what he knows is his business to share. "Name's familiar," he said, which was not a yes. "He has a ranch outside town," Eliza said. "I've come from Massachusetts. We've been corresponding." "Ah." The station master looked at her trunk, then at her bag, then at the empty platform. "Well," he said, "sometimes men get held up." "Yes," said Eliza. "You've got somewhere to wait that's out of the wind?" "I'll wait here for now. Thank you." He went back inside. She heard the stove grate open and close through the thin wall. She sat down on the nearest bench and put her hands in her lap and made herself breathe evenly. The mountains were still there in the distance, enormous and indifferent. The wind moved through the gap between the station building and the fence and found the back of her neck with absolute precision. She thought about the letter she'd received in August, the second to last one before she'd sent her own final letter saying she was coming, giving him the train number and the arrival time, and asking if there was anything she should bring that he didn't have. He'd written back promptly. He had a good kitchen, he said. 2 spare rooms, though one had boxes he hadn't dealt with since Margaret, his late wife, had passed. He'd said he would clear them out before Eliza arrived. He'd said there was a window above the kitchen sink that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that felt almost apologetic, as though the sun knew it was asking something of you and wanted to at least look beautiful while it did it. That detail had stayed with her. A man who noticed what a kitchen window did with morning light was not the kind of man who wrote letters as strategy. He was the kind of man who actually looked at things. That was what she'd believed anyway. Now, sitting on a cold wooden bench in a town she'd never seen, watching an hour pass on the face of the clock mounted to the station wall, she was beginning to have a different kind of thought. One she kept pushing aside because she wasn't ready for it. Because if she let herself think it, really think it, it would require her to recalculate everything. The letters. The 4 months of careful, patient correspondence. The decision, the train ticket, the goodbye to her mother at a drafty Boston station at 6 a.m, her mother's face doing something complicated that Eliza had told herself was hope. She pushed the thought aside again. She would wait another hour. 2 hours later, the sun had moved and the shadow of the station building had reached her feet. The station master had brought her a cup of something hot that turned out to be weak coffee and had said nothing, which she appreciated. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Eliza Hartwell allowed herself to have the thought. He wasn't coming. She sat with it for a moment. She didn't cry, because crying was for when the thing was certain, and she still had the thin, stubborn possibility that something had happened. An accident, an emergency, a horse gone lame in a ditch somewhere. She held on to that possibility because it was the last version of things where the letters had been real. But underneath that, underneath the practical, sensible explanations, something colder and harder was settling into her chest. She recognized it the way you recognize the smell of weather changing. Not a smell exactly, just a knowledge. The knowledge that something was wrong in a way that good luck was not going to fix. She was in Montana. She had $14 and some change in the bottom of her bag. She had a trunk with everything she owned. She knew no one in this town, in this state, in this entire half of the country. She needed to think. She was still sitting with that thought. Not panicking, she told herself. She was absolutely not panicking. She was thinking, when the door of the station building opened and the station master came out, and behind him, or rather to the side of him, was a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, not dramatically so. Not the kind of tall you noticed right away as a feature of a person, but tall the way a fence post was tall, meaning it was simply what he was built like, and it looked like it had always been that way. He wore a coat that had seen considerable weather and boots that had seen considerably more, and he had the look of someone who had spent enough time outdoors that his face had made a kind of accommodation with the sun and wind and stopped complaining about them. He might have been 35. He might have been 42. It was genuinely difficult to tell. He looked at her the way men in this part of the world seemed to look at things. Not rudely, not dismissively, but with a kind of careful assessment that didn't waste motion, like he was tallying up something before he made a decision. "Bill says you've been waiting since the 11:45, he said. His voice was not what she'd expected. Lower and quieter. The kind of voice that didn't have to compete because it had never been in the habit of competing. "Yes," she said. "Person coming to meet you?" She considered the question with more care than it probably deserved, given that it was a simple question. "I had reason to believe so." He nodded slowly, as though she'd said something requiring thought. "Cornelius Aldridge." She stiffened. "You know him?" "Knew of him," the man said, and something in the slight adjustment of those two words, knew versus know, of versus him directly, made her stomach tighten. "I'm Garrick Hale. I have a spread about 4 miles north of town." He paused. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" The directness of this question caught her slightly off guard. She had been braced for something else. Pity, or curiosity, or the particular male discomfort of a stranger's predicament being thrust upon him. But this man looked at her without any of that. He just asked what was actually relevant. "Not yet," she said. "There's a boarding house on Clement Street," he said. "Mrs. Faber runs it. It's clean, and she doesn't charge for supper on the night of arrival. She has a policy about that." He seemed to consider adding something and then not add it. "She's decent." Eliza looked at him. She was not the kind of woman who made decisions quickly on the basis of a face. She'd learned that lesson in the last 8 months, hadn't she? But she was the kind of woman who paid attention to small things. The way the station master was standing slightly behind this man, but without the posture of someone who was afraid of him. The way the man had said, "It's clean," before anything else, as though he'd guessed what her first concern would be. The fact that he had offered information, not help. That distinction was subtle, but real. "How far is Clement Street?" she asked. 6 minutes walking, he said. "I can carry your trunk as far as the end of Borden Avenue if you like. After that, it's a straight shot." She should have declined. She understood that. The common-sense version of herself stood slightly apart from the moment and noted that accepting help from a stranger on a train platform in a town she didn't know was not the most cautious plan she'd ever formed. But the light was changing. In another 2 hours, it would be dark. She was tired in the specific way that was more about disappointment than distance, the kind of tired that got into your joints and made everything heavier. And this man had not asked her a single question she didn't want to answer. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." He lifted her trunk, and she noticed that he picked it up without testing the weight first, which told her he'd already estimated it and decided it wasn't a problem. And she picked up her bag and they walked off the platform together in the direction he indicated. Mrs. Faber was 63 years old and had opinions about window latches, mail delivery, and the character of any man whose horse stood poorly hitched. But she had a room available on the second floor with a quilt that Eliza could have wept over. It was so heavy and warm. "You came on the 11:45?" Mrs. Faber said, filling out the register with a pen she held with the authority of someone signing legal documents. "The Aldridge letters, I take it." Eliza went very still. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Faber looked up. Her eyes were sharp behind square-framed spectacles. "You're not the first girl to come off that train looking for Cornelius Aldridge," she said, not unkindly, but with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned not to soften things too much because softening them too much helped no one. You're the third this year that I've seen, though I imagine there may have been others who found their way before they reached me. The world did something strange for a moment. The room tipped very slightly, the way a deck does under your feet in water, and then righted itself. The third? What happened to the others? Eliza asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, actually. Even in that moment she registered it, the fact that her voice had not broken or gone high. Mrs. Faber set down her pen. First girl went back east on the next train. Second one, a girl from Ohio, bright as a coin, she stayed. Works at the dressmakers on 2nd Street now. Nice girl. She paused. I could introduce you if it would help to talk to someone who's walked the same ground. Eliza set her hand on the register. Does anyone know where Mr. Aldridge lives? His actual whereabouts? There's talk, Mrs. Faber said carefully. But what I know for certain is that there is no ranch outside Red Creek with that name on the deed. I had occasion to check after the second girl. She met Eliza's eyes. Whatever he told you, Miss Hartwell. Whatever he told you, Miss Hartwell, I don't believe he intends to be found. The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room the way smoke filled a room. Completely, and from every direction at once. Eliza looked at the quilt on the bed she couldn't yet afford for more than 2 weeks. She looked at the window which faced west and had the light dying behind it. She thought about $14 and her mother's face at the Boston station. Then she put her hand out and signed the register. I'll take the room, she said, and I'll take you up on the supper. Mrs. Faber looked at her with something that was not quite respect and not quite sympathy, and was possibly some mixture of both that didn't have a word yet. Supper's at 6, she said. Don't be late, the gravy doesn't hold. She did not sleep well, which was to be expected. The room was warm enough. The quilt was as good as it had looked. But her mind did what minds did when the thing they had been organized around for months suddenly ceased to exist. It spun. It backed up and took different roads and ran into the same wall from different angles. It went through the letters, all of them, and searched for the places where she should have seen something, a crack, an inconsistency, a false note in the music of his words. She didn't find anything. That was the unsettling part. Looking back at 8 months of correspondence with the knowledge of what it had turned out to be, she still couldn't point to the place where the lie had shown itself. He had been consistent. He had been specific. He had said things about the ranch, about the particular mud that came off the creek banks in spring, about the way the barn door stuck in wet weather, about the cat that had come with the property and refused to be named and simply existed in a state of permanent disdain that felt too particular to be invented. Either he was a very good liar or he had told someone else's truth, borrowed the details of an actual life and used them to build a false one on paper. She thought about that for a while. Then she turned over and looked at the ceiling and made herself stop. She was here. She had no money to speak of. She had skills. She could do figures. She'd always been quick with numbers. And she could write a clear business letter, and she could manage a ledger because she'd helped the factory floor manager do exactly that for 2 years before he noticed she was better at it than he was and had her transferred back to the shirt inspection station before anyone got any ideas. She had a strong back, and she didn't get sick easily, and she didn't cry in front of people. Those were not nothing. Montana in October was cold, and the world here felt enormous and mostly empty. And she was 23 years old and alone in a boarding house room paid for through the end of the week only, but she had been less than nothing before and had found her way to something. She would find her way to something again. She just needed a place to start. She was still turning that thought over when sleep finally came for her, somewhere past midnight, without ceremony. Breakfast at Mrs. Faber's was a serious affair. There were 6 other boarders, a school teacher named Miss Pratt, who had an expression of chronic mild alarm, 2 mining surveyors who spoke to each other in a shorthand of numbers and compass directions, an older man named Mr. Denny, who had come to Red Creek for reasons no one seemed certain of, including possibly Mr. Denny himself, and a young couple, the Stearns, who had arrived from Kansas and were building a house north of town. They ate biscuits and salt pork and eggs that Mrs. Faber scrambled with butter in a heavy iron pan, and the schoolteacher asked Eliza where she was from and what had brought her to Red Creek, and whether she had come for the schoolteacher position, because the position was still available, and she'd heard the school board was getting anxious. "What position?" Eliza asked. Eliza told. "They lost their school teacher in August," Miss Pratt said, reaching for another biscuit with no apparent self-consciousness about it. "She married a man from Butte and followed him there. They've been looking since. The board is picky, or they say they're picky, though what they're actually being about it, I couldn't say." She buttered the biscuit with efficiency. "Can you teach?" "I've never done it professionally," Eliza said. "Neither had I before I started," said Miss Pratt. "It's mostly organization and patience and the willingness to repeat yourself." Eliza filed that information away somewhere near the back of her mind where she was keeping options. After breakfast, she went out onto Clement Street and stood in the pale morning and thought about what she actually needed, in order, and what she was going to do about each thing. It was her habit. Had been since she was a girl helping her mother account for the household money every Friday evening, to make problems into lists. Lists could be worked through. Problems that stayed as shapeless masses of anxiety could not. Item 1. Money. She needed to earn some. Item 2. Information. She needed to understand where she was and what was available in it. Item 3. A plan that extended past next Friday. She was still standing there with her arms crossed and her breath making small clouds in the cold air when she heard boots on the boards behind her and turned and found Garrick Hale, of all people, coming out of the hardware store across the street with a length of chain over one shoulder and a brown paper package under his arm. He saw her, stopped. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Hale." They looked at each other for a moment in the way of two people who have no particular history and thus no script for the encounter. "You find Mrs. Faber all right?" he asked. "I did. Thank you." He nodded. He seemed to be conducting some internal deliberation. It showed on his face in a way that was not quite readable, not the exaggerated processing of a man performing thought, but the actual visible effort of someone working something out carefully before he committed to it. "I have a question," he said finally. "All right," she said. "You have any experience with figures, accounting, ledger keeping, that kind of thing?" Eliza blinked. Of all the things she had imagined someone might say to her on a sidewalk in Red Creek, Montana at 8:15 in the morning, that had not been on the list. "Yes," she said. "Some experience. More than some, actually." Garrick Hale shifted the chain on his shoulder. "My books are a mess," he said. "There was no embarrassment in it, no apology. Just a statement of fact, the way he might say that his fence needed mending, or his roof had a soft spot. 3 years' worth of accounts that I've been keeping in the way of someone who knows very little about keeping accounts. I've been told it needs sorting, but I keep not getting around to it." He paused. "I'd pay fair, not charity money, actual wages for actual work." Eliza studied him. He was looking at her with the same careful, non-excessive attention he'd had on the platform the day before. He was not, she noticed, looking at her in any of the ways that men sometimes looked at women in moments of vulnerability. Not with condescension, not with pity dressed up as generosity, not with the particular proprietary interest that showed up sometimes when men thought they were doing you a favor you'd have to repay. He just looked like a man who had a problem and was considering whether the solution was standing in front of him. "How many years of accounts?" she asked. 3 going on 4, he said. "Maybe closer to 4. "Do you have everything? Original receipts, invoices, anything that money touched?" He thought about it. "Most of it. I put things in boxes. There are boxes." She almost smiled at that. She kept the smile internal. "What are you paying per day?" He named a figure. It was fair. Not lavish, but fair, which was exactly what he'd promised it would be. She considered for a moment longer because she was not going to accept things too quickly, not anymore, not after 8 months of trusting the next thing too easily. But this was different from the letters. This was work. Concrete, specific, answerable work. She could audit her own progress on this. She could check her work against his records. It was not a promise of a life. It was an offer of a day's labor at a stated rate by a man who had, so far, done exactly what he said he would do. That was a low bar. But right now, it was the only bar she had. "All right," she said. "When do you want me to start?" "Day after tomorrow," he said. "Give you a day to settle." "Tomorrow is fine," she said. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of something. Tomorrow then, he said. Ranch is 4 miles north on the creek road. There's a sign at the gate. Hail, it says. Not complicated. I'll find it, she said. He nodded and moved on down the street. She watched him go for a moment, the chain over his shoulder, the paper package, the particular way he walked like a man who had a destination and had already committed to it. Then she turned back toward Mrs. Faber's and went in to ask if there was any chance of a cup of coffee before lunch. The road to Hale Ranch was exactly 4 miles if you counted them, which Eliza did on principle. It ran north from the edge of town along a creek that was running low and fast in the cold, bordered on both sides by cottonwood trees that had gone mostly gold with the season and were beginning to let go. The road was dirt-packed hard by wagon wheels and horse hooves and was not muddy, for which she was grateful, because her boots were not waterproof and the walk was long enough as it was. She arrived at 7:30 in the morning because she did not believe in arriving late, and she did not believe in arriving exactly on time if early was an option. The ranch was not what she had built in her imagination for the ranch of Cornelius Aldridge. That imagined ranch had been clean in a hopeful way, freshly mended, a place trying to be its best self in preparation for her arrival. Hale Ranch was clean in a different way. Clean the way a thing was clean when someone maintained it out of function rather than pride. The fences were solid but unpainted. The barn was large and practical. The house itself was a 2-story structure of weathered wood, with a porch that ran along the front and had a bench on one end where someone had left a pair of work gloves and forgotten to take them in. Garrick Hale came out of the barn when he heard her on the porch steps. "You found it," he said. "I said I would," she said. He considered that for half a second. "Coffee's on," he said. "Oh, come in." The kitchen was the first room she saw, and she understood immediately what he had meant about the accounts. The room itself was organized, not spotless, but organized, the way a working space was organized by someone who knew exactly where everything was and whose system, while invisible to outsiders, was evidently working. But on the table, which was large and made of a dark, heavy wood that had clearly started life as something older, there were 3 wooden boxes of paper. She could see receipts sticking out from between envelopes and folded pages, and what appeared to be the remnants of a grain sack on which someone had written figures in pencil. "That's not all of it," Garrick said, handing her a coffee cup from the stove. She noticed he'd already poured it, which meant he'd timed her arrival approximately and planned accordingly. "Where's the rest?" she asked. "Front room," he said, "and the top of the wardrobe. And there may be a box in the barn that I've been telling myself isn't financial, but I have a feeling it might be." Eliza picked up a piece of paper from the nearest box. A receipt for seed, dated 3 years ago, written in someone else's hand and signed at the bottom. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "I've seen worse," she said, which was not strictly true, but the lie was a professional one, the kind you told to keep the situation workable rather than to deceive. She sat down at the table and put her coffee to one side and said, "I'm going to need everything. Every piece of paper that has a number on it from the last 4 years. Every receipt, every invoice, every note you wrote yourself in the margin of anything. Can you get me the barn box first?" Garrick set down his own coffee and went out to the barn without saying anything further. She heard the barn doors, and while he was gone, she moved the 3 boxes into a line and began establishing what she was dealing with. By noon, the table was covered in papers arranged by year, which she had determined by the dates. 3 years back, 2 years back, last year, and the current one, which was mercifully thin. By 2 o'clock, she had 2 columns running in the ledger she'd found in the bottom of the 3rd box, mercifully blank. And she had identified what appeared to be a systematic error in the way he'd been recording feed costs that had, over 3 years, resulted in a discrepancy that was not ruinous, but was considerably larger than it should have been. Garrick came in at noon with a plate of bread and cold meat that he set at the end of the table without interrupting her work, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He ate standing at the counter. She ate while she read receipts. They did not speak for most of an hour. At 2:30, he came in again for water and looked at the table and stopped. "You've already sorted 3 years," he said. "Mostly," she said. "I have questions about feed costs." "Ask them." She asked them. He answered them, directly, without defensiveness, with the particular precision of someone who actually remembered things, even if he hadn't written them down correctly. She wrote as he talked. He refilled both their coffee cups without being asked. At 5 o'clock, she put down her pen and said, "I'll need to come back tomorrow." "All right," he said. "The discrepancy in the feed column is correctable, but it's going to take time. You're not as far off as the books make you look." He looked at the table. "Is it bad?" "It's recoverable," she said, which was the more useful answer. He nodded. He seemed like someone who had heard worse news than recoverable and had therefore learned to consider it good. "I'll drive you back to town," he said. "You don't need to—" "It's nearly dark," he said. Not as an argument, just as information. The way he said things. She considered the 4 miles of road in the dying October light and made a practical decision. "Thank you," she said. On the drive back, they didn't talk much. The horses moved at a steady walk, and the evening came down over the valley in layers of gray and gold. Somewhere along the creek road a bird called once and was quiet. She realized, not thinking about the empty platform. She was thinking about the discrepancy in the feed column and how to correct it. That felt, improbably, like progress. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, she had built a clear picture of the ranch's finances across 4 years, and the picture was messier than it needed to be, but not catastrophically so. Garrick had been running the place the way a man ran a place when he was doing it alone, after not having been alone for the first several years of ownership, which was to say, by feel, by memory, by approximate math that was not quite wrong enough to cause crisis, but was never quite right either. She organized it. That was what she did. She built a system. Simple, clear, the kind that could be maintained by someone who was not a trained bookkeeper, but was a man of reasonable intelligence who actually looked at things, which she had concluded Garrick Hale was. She left notes at each section. She labeled columns in language a rancher would actually use rather than accounting terminology that served no one who lived their life in a barn and a pasture. Each morning when she arrived, there was coffee already poured. She stopped noticing this after the 3rd day, which meant she had started expecting it, which she caught herself noticing and thought about for a moment before letting it go. Each day he worked outside while she worked inside, and he came in at meals and sometimes sat at the other end of the table reading the week-old newspaper he picked up from town. And sometimes they talked about what she was finding in the accounts, and sometimes they talked about nothing specific, and sometimes they did not talk at all, and she found that the silence was not uncomfortable. That was strange. She had been uncomfortable in silences since she was a girl, always feeling that something should be said to fill them. Silence with Garrick Hale felt less like an absence and more like a pause, the kind of pause between sentences where the meaning of what was already said was still settling. She did not think about this too carefully. She had other things to think about. On the 9th day, she arrived to find something on the corner of the table where her ledger was, a small object carved from a pale wood she didn't recognize. A bird, roughly made but recognizable. A sparrow or something in the sparrow family, with wings slightly lifted as though it had just stopped and was deciding whether to go again. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down and started work and did not mention it. At noon, when Garrick came in with 2 bowls of whatever he'd had simmering on the stove since morning, a bean soup that was better than it had any right to be, she had decided, she said without looking up from the ledger, "Who made the bird?" A pause. "I did," he said. "It's good work," she said. "It passes the time," he said. She set the bird on the windowsill above the table where it could see the room and went back to the numbers. He said nothing. But she noticed that when he refilled her coffee cup an hour later, he glanced at the window, and something in his face had done something small and quiet that she couldn't fully interpret and did not try to. She just let it be. Outside, the October wind was moving through the cottonwoods, and the mountains were doing what they always did, which was exist with enormous and patient indifference to everything happening below them. The ranch was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was occupied. It was a place where work was being done, where things were being made right that had gone wrong. Eliza Hartwell sharpened her pencil and went back to the accounts. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the day had the feeling of a day that was hers, not promised to her by someone else, not borrowed from a future that might not exist. Just hers, right now, in this room, on this cold October morning at the edge of the frontier. She wrote a number in the ledger column and moved on to the next line. Outside, one of the horses moved in its stall with a sound like approval, 3 weeks in, Eliza had developed what she privately called her walking routine, though routine was maybe too generous a word for something that had evolved mostly by accident. She left Mrs. Faber's at 7, walked the creek road in whatever the morning had decided to be: frost, thin sunshine, the occasional aggressive wind that came down off the mountains like it had somewhere to be, and arrived at Hale Ranch by 7:30. She had tried arriving at 7:15 once and found the coffee not yet ready, which had told her something useful about the exact timing of Garrick's mornings, and she had adjusted accordingly. The road had become familiar in the way that roads became familiar when you walked them daily, not memorized exactly, but absorbed. She knew where the mud stayed wet longest after rain. She knew the cottonwood with the split trunk halfway along that had a family of something living in the hollow, though she'd never seen them, only heard them. She knew that the mountains looked different at 7 in the morning than they did at 5 in the afternoon, and that both versions were worth looking at, though she generally only let herself look for a moment before she got her eyes back on the road, because she had work to do, and the mountains would still be there when the work was done. Her savings had stretched further than she'd expected, partly because Mrs. Faber's rates were reasonable, and partly because Montana, she was discovering, did not require as much money as Massachusetts had. There was less to spend it on, for one thing. The town of Red Creek had a general store, a hardware store, the saloon she'd never entered, a dressmaker, a barber shop, a small church she also never entered, and a post office that seemed to function primarily as a social institution, secondarily to its postal duties. There was no department store. There was no city market with 40 varieties of vegetable. There was what there was, and what there was turned out to be mostly enough. She had also, quietly and without making an event of it, introduced herself to the school board chairman, a round-faced man named Mr. Calloway, who ran the feed store and seemed to carry his civic responsibilities with the slightly burdened air of someone who had volunteered for something before fully understanding what it involved. She had told him she had experience with numbers and with letters, and that she'd been told the teaching position was available, and she would like to be considered if it came to that. He'd looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalibrating his day. She'd left him with her name written on a piece of paper and had gone back to the creek road and not thought about it further, because she was not going to pin herself to a possibility the way she had made the mistake of pinning herself to one before. What she had instead was the ranch. By the end of the 3rd week, the accounts were fully reconciled. All 4 years, all 3 boxes plus the barn box, plus the 2 additional envelopes she'd found tucked inside a copy of a livestock manual on the kitchen shelf, which she had extracted with the calm patience of a woman who had stopped being surprised by where men filed their paperwork. She had built Garrick a ledger system that she had written instructions for in clear handwriting on a card she'd tacked to the inside cover. She had identified that he had been overpaying for winter feed by approximately 12% for 2 consecutive years because of a supplier relationship that had calcified into habit rather than ongoing value, and she had found a competitor supplier in the county records whose rates were better. She had told him all of this one afternoon while he stood at the counter eating an apple and listening with his full attention in the way he had, not performing attentiveness, just actually attending, which was different and rarer. 12%, he said when she finished. Over 2 winters, she said. It adds up. I know Bickers, he said, meaning the current feed supplier. We've been doing business since before Margaret. He said his wife's name the way people said the names of the dead, naturally, but with a slight weight to it, as though the name itself had more gravity than other words. I know, Eliza said. I'm not saying cut him off. I'm saying negotiate. Tell him you've seen other rates and you want him to meet them. He'll either meet them or he won't, and then you know what your loyalty is actually worth to him. Garrick looked at his apple. You think like that a lot, he said. Not a criticism, an observation. I grew up watching my mother think like that, she said. We didn't have much room for sentiment in our math. He nodded slowly. He set the apple core on the counter and said, I'll talk to Bickers. She went back to the ledger. Outside, one of the horses, the dark one she'd learned was named General for reasons nobody had explained to her, moved in the corral with a sound of mild equine impatience. The work was supposed to be finished. She'd done what she'd been hired to do. The accounts were reconciled, the system was built, the instructions were written. Eliza had understood this quietly for a couple of days and had kept working anyway because the system needed testing, needed someone to run a few weeks through it to confirm it held. That was what she told herself. She was still telling herself that when Garrett came in from the pasture on a cold Wednesday morning, colder than usual, with ice in his beard from where his breath had frozen on the walk from the lower field, and said, "There's another box." She looked up. Of receipts? No? He set his hat on the hook and sat down heavily in the chair across the table. He had the look of a man who had been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at the decision to say it without being entirely comfortable with the decision. "There's a set of books I didn't show you at the start, from the year before Margaret passed. I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't sure what was in them, wasn't ready to look." The room was quiet except for the stove working. "Do you want me to look at them?" Eliza asked. He considered the ceiling briefly. "I want them sorted," he said. "Same as the others. I don't want to go in there not knowing what the numbers are." He paused. "The ranch has to make sense going forward. Can't do that if I'm keeping boxes I won't open." She understood that this was about more than bookkeeping. She also understood that saying so would accomplish nothing useful. "I can look at them tomorrow," she said. "Bring them in tonight. Leave them on the table." He did. She found them there the next morning, a plain wooden box with a brass latch set at the far end of the table from her usual spot. She opened it and went through it the way she went through everything, carefully, without editorializing, building the picture from what the papers said rather than from what she expected them to say. What they said mostly was that the year before Margaret Hale died had been a lean one, a bad spring, a worse summer. The kind of year that tested a ranch the way weather tests a roof, by finding every place that was not quite solid and making it worse. Garrick had held it together, but the numbers showed the places he'd borrowed against and the places he'd sold early and the places where he'd simply absorbed a loss and kept moving. The handwriting in the margins of those pages was different from his current handwriting, tighter, more pressured, the writing of someone who was tired in the deep way and still had to keep accounting for things. She worked through the box without comment. She integrated the numbers into the larger picture. She made a note in her own ledger that she would show him when she was done. When she did show him, 3 days later, he looked at the page for a long time. "It's not as bad as you thought it was," she said. "Looking back." "No," he said. "I suppose it's not." He was quiet for a moment. At the time it felt close. It felt closer than this looks. "Years always look different from the outside," she said. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression that she was beginning to learn to read. A small calibration, the way his eyes changed when he was actually considering what someone had said rather than just receiving it. "You've had a few of those years," he said. It was not a question. "A few," she said. She did not elaborate because she was not ready to elaborate, and he did not press because he seemed to understand instinctively the difference between a door left ajar and one that was actually open. The box from Margaret's year went onto the shelf with the others, and the accounts were done, and Eliza had no more professional reason to be at Hale Ranch. She walked the creek road home that afternoon with her hands in her pockets and thought about that. She thought about it again the next morning when she woke up and realized that her first thought, before anything else, had been about whether the discrepancy she'd found yesterday in the livestock column had been resolved by the correction she'd made, or whether it needed another look. Which meant her first thought of the day had been about the ranch's books, which meant something she was not going to think about too directly. She went back. She told herself she was checking her own work. She was technically not wrong. She did check her own work and found it correct, and found also that Garrick had entered 2 new transactions in the ledger using the system she'd built, and had done it correctly, and had written the date in the format she'd specified in the instructions. He was in the barn when she came in. She heard him through the wall, talking to General in the low, unremarkable way he talked to the horse. Not baby talk, not theatrical, just ordinary conversation about what was going to happen that day and what he needed the horse to understand about it. It was, she found, a surprisingly easy thing to listen to through a thin wall. She poured her own coffee. She sat down. She opened the ledger to confirm what she'd found. The door from the barn opened and he came in brushing straw off his coat and stopped when he saw her. "Didn't hear you come in," he said. "I let myself in," she said. "I hope that's—" "It's fine," he said. "The door's not locked." She noted that he did not ask why she was there. He went to the stove and poured his own coffee, and came to the table and sat down across from her and looked at the ledger. "Did I do it wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. "You did it exactly right." He nodded. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. "I've been thinking," he said after a minute. She waited. "The books are sorted," he said, "but there's the end-of-year accounting coming up in December, and then the spring purchases in February." He turned his coffee cup in both hands, a gesture she had observed before, and come to understand as him working up to something. It would be easier, having someone who already understands the system. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking out of charity," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The work is real. The spring is busy, and the accounting doesn't stop being messy just because it's warm outside." "I know," she said. "I'd pay the same rate," he said, "through at least the end of March." She put both hands around her own cup and felt the warmth of it, and looked at the ledger, which was neat now, which had been a mess, and was now a system that worked, and thought about the creek road in the early morning and the coffee already poured and the carved bird on the windowsill above the table. "All right," she said. He did not smile exactly, but something in his face settled. The specific relaxation of a man who had been holding a tension he hadn't fully admitted to and had now been allowed to put it down. "Through March," she said, "and then we'll see." "Through March," he agreed. Outside, November was beginning to arrive in the way that November arrived in Montana. Not gradually, not gently, but with the complete commitment of a season that had no patience for the previous one. The creek was icing at the edges. The mornings were dark longer. The mountains had acquired a new covering of snow that had come down overnight without announcement, the way snow did in this country, taking what it wanted without asking. Eliza put her cup down and opened the ledger to the current month and picked up her pencil and went back to work. She was, she realized, with a small, cautious, private acknowledgement that she did not examine too closely, not unhappy. That was not a small thing. Not for a woman who had arrived on an empty platform 6 weeks ago with $14 in a trunk, and a humiliation she hadn't yet found the language for. Not unhappy was, in the context of what October had been, something close to remarkable. She didn't let herself feel too much about it. She had learned, recently and specifically, the cost of letting yourself feel too much about things before they had proven themselves. But she noticed it. She wrote a number in the ledger column, and she noticed it quietly, the way you noticed the first morning when the cold had a different quality to it, and understood without anyone having to tell you that something had shifted in the world. The stove ticked. General moved in the barn. The pencil scratched across the page. December came in hard. The creek froze solid by the second week, and the road to the ranch acquired a particular cruelty in the mornings. A thin skin of ice under a dusting of new snow that looked like solid ground and was not. Eliza had fallen once, in the third week of November, catching herself on one hand and one knee and sitting in the road for a moment taking inventory of what hurt before she got up and kept walking. She hadn't told anyone. There was no one to tell, and besides, it was just a fall. The hand had bruised. It had unbruised. She had learned to walk differently on that road after that, slower, weight distributed more carefully, reading the surface before she trusted it. Montana was teaching her things that Massachusetts had not needed to teach her, and she was, on balance, learning them. The end-of-year accounts at the ranch had taken most of November to assemble properly, partly because December brought with it a set of expenses that needed to be projected rather than recorded. Feed stores for winter, repairs that had to be planned before the ground froze too hard to work, and partly because Garrick had expanded what he was asking her to do in the incremental, almost unnoticeable way he did things, adding one question and then another until she realized she was functioning less as a bookkeeper and more as something closer to a business manager, which was a title that didn't quite exist for a ranch of this size, but described what was actually happening. She had not objected. The work was interesting. More interesting than shirt inspection had been, more interesting than most things she'd done with her days, and it paid enough that she had settled her debt at Mrs. Faber's through January, and had sent money home to her mother in a letter that had been carefully factual about her circumstances, without being either falsely cheerful or worryingly honest. Her mother had written back promptly, as she always did. The letter had said, among other things, "I don't need the money, Eliza, but I'll keep it since you clearly need me to. Tell me about the place. Tell me about the people." Her mother's handwriting was the same as it had always been, angular and fast, the writing of a woman who had things to say and limited time to say them. Reading it made Eliza's chest do something complicated that she didn't let herself sit with for too long. She had written back describing the mountains, the way the light worked in the mornings, Mrs. Faber's opinions about window latches. She had not described Garrick Hale at all because she was not sure what she would say if she started, and she was not ready to find out. It was the second Friday of December when she went into town for the post office, which she did every Friday unless the weather made it impossible. She had a letter to mail to her mother and a package Mrs. Faber had asked her to collect, and she had a list of 3 other small errands that would take her no more than 40 minutes total, which was the kind of efficiency she had gotten used to applying to her Fridays in town. She was coming out of the general store when she heard voices from inside the post office next door. The post office shared a thin wall with the general store, and the wall was, as she had occasion to know, not particularly well constructed. Normally, this did not matter. The post office conversations she half heard were about mail delivery schedules and the price of stamps and whether or not a particular parcel had arrived yet, and was it definitely the right parcel, because last time they'd sent the wrong one. But she was putting her change into her purse, and she caught a name, and her hands went still. Aldridge. She stood very quietly next to the store's front window, not moving, not looking like someone who was listening, because she was 23 years old, and she had grown up in a house with thin walls and had learned early that the way to hear things was to look as though you weren't trying to. The voices belonged to 2 men she didn't recognize, one older, one younger. She could tell by the register without seeing them. The older one seemed to be the one with information, and the younger one was receiving it in the way of someone who already knew part of the story and was filling in the gaps. Had his wife with him the whole time, apparently, the older one said. Lives out near Bozeman, railroad work, good steady income. And the letters? The younger one said. Entertainment, the older one said, and the word landed with a flatness that was somehow worse than anger. That's what they're saying, that he did it for the letters back, liked being written to, liked the idea of it. Lord, said the younger one, 3 or 4 women over the past few years, far as anyone's pieced together. None of them ever made it quite as far as Red Creek before, I think. This last one. Eliza pushed the door of the general store open and walked out onto the street. The cold hit her face, and she stood on the wooden boards of the sidewalk and breathed it in and let it do what it did, which was nothing helpful, but at least it was something physical, something real and present and honest about what it was. Entertainment. She had been entertainment, not a con for money. There had been no money asked of her directly, though she'd spent her own getting here, but that had been her choice, her cost. Not something he'd extracted, not even a scheme with a clear aim, just letters. He had wanted to receive letters from a woman who believed in him, and he had manufactured a version of himself worth believing in, and she had believed it, and apparently she was not even the first or the second to do so. She did not cry on the sidewalk. She thought for a moment that she might, because the thing that was happening inside her chest was large and pressurized and needed somewhere to go. But she was also standing on the main street of a small town where she was already known as the woman who'd come off the train looking for a man who wasn't there, and she was not going to give Red Creek a second scene. She collected Mrs. Faber's package. She mailed her letter. She walked back to the boarding house and went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for approximately 10 minutes, very still, while the thing in her chest worked itself out into something more manageable. Then she got up, put on her coat again, and walked the 4 miles to the ranch. Garrick was mending a section of fence near the barn when she came through the gate, and he looked up at her face and set down his tools without her having said a word. What happened? He said. She told him all of it, what she'd overheard and what it meant, and the parts she'd been filling in on the walk over with the particular grim efficiency of someone who had been adding up a column and had finally reached the total. She told him about the wife in Bozeman and the railroad work and the word the man in the post office had used, entertainment, and her own voice stayed level through most of it and went slightly uneven at that last part, which she had not fully anticipated. Garrick listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without making sounds of sympathy or outrage that she would have found unbearable. When she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. The wind moved through the fence boards with a thin whistle. Married, he said finally. It seems so. The whole time. Presumably, since before he wrote the first letter. Garrick picked up the fence tool he'd set down and turned it in his hands. He was not, she could tell, turning it because he was fidgeting. He was turning it because he needed something to do with his hands while he managed his own reaction, which was visible to her in the set of his jaw and the careful, controlled stillness of the rest of him. "I can find out where he is," he said. His voice was quiet. The quieter his voice got, she had learned, the more serious the thing behind it. If there are legal avenues, the correspondence, the train fare, you spent, that's not nothing. That might be something a lawyer could work with. "I know," she said. "Do you want me to look into it?" She stood in the cold in his side yard with the fence half mended beside her and thought about what she wanted. Actually thought about it, not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a real question that deserved a real answer. What she wanted was to not have gotten on the train. That was the truthful answer, the one at the bottom of all the others. She wanted to have been smarter, or more suspicious, or less willing to believe that 8 months of letters from a stranger could add up to a life. She wanted her mother to have been wrong when she'd said gently and once, in October before Eliza left, "Are you sure you know enough about him, Eliza?" She wanted to not be standing in Montana in December having this conversation. But that was not what Garrick had asked. He had asked whether she wanted him to look into legal options, whether she wanted to pursue what had been done to her through the channels that existed for pursuing such things. She thought about it. She thought about what that would mean. The inquiry, the letter, the process of establishing what had happened to some official's satisfaction. The public documentation of the fact that she had been deceived by a married railroad worker who had written her letters for amusement. The necessity of being, in legal terms, the woman who had been fooled. "No," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want to spend the next year being the person that happened to," she said. "I'm already that person. I don't want to make it a project." Garrick was quiet for a moment. "It's not weakness," he said, "not pursuing it." "I know that," she said. And she did know it, though she appreciated that he'd said it because there was a part of her that was working very hard to believe it. "It's not about weakness. It's about what I want my time to be spent on." She looked at the fence. "Is that the section that was coming loose?" He blinked at the change of direction. "Yes." "I thought you said it could wait until spring." "I did say that," he admitted. "Then I looked at it yesterday and decided I'd been wrong." She almost smiled. She pulled her coat closer and said, "Do you need a second set of hands, or are you managing? You're not dressed for fence work. I'm warmly dressed. That's not the same thing." He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention he had, assessing, not intrusive, taking stock of what was actually there rather than what he expected. "Hold this," he said, and handed her one end of the wire he'd been working with. She held it. He worked the other end, pulling the slack out of it and fixing it to the post with the deft, practiced motion of someone who had done this particular repair many times and had stopped thinking about the individual steps. His hands in their heavy work gloves moved with the same quality she had noticed in his whole manner. Not rushed, not slow, but calibrated to exactly the speed the task required. They worked in silence for a while. The cold was genuine and persistent, and she could feel it through her boots despite the wool socks, but the work helped. "He's going to keep doing it," she said, after a while. "Writing to women, unless someone stops him." "Yes," Garrick said. He pulled the wire taut. "I could write to someone, not a lawyer. One of the agencies, the one I used to find—" She stopped. She had not said the man's name aloud since arriving in Red Creek, and she found she didn't want to start now. "The correspondence agency in Boston. They should know what he's using them for." Garrick looked up from the wire. "That's a good idea," he said. "It's not justice," she said, "but it might prevent the next one." "It might," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll do it this weekend." He nodded. He finished the wire and stood back and looked at the fence, and then looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said. It was a simple question. Ordinary people asked it a dozen times a day as pleasantry and meant nothing by it. But Garrick Hale, she had come to understand, did not ask things he didn't mean. He looked at her when he asked it with the direct, unperformative attention she had gotten used to and still found slightly disarming. And what he was actually asking was, "Tell me what's true, not what's polite." She considered it honestly. "I'm angry," she said. "Not crying angry. More like, there's a door I can see that I want to walk through, and I keep having to stand in front of it instead of opening it." He thought about that. "What's on the other side of the door?" "Just forward," she said. "Just being ahead of this." He was quiet. Then, "You're closer to that door than you think you are." She didn't know if that was true, but he said it the way he said most things, not as reassurance, not as the kind of thing you said to make a person feel better, but as an observation he'd made and was reporting, the way he'd report the weather, or the state of the feed stock, or the fact that a fence that needed fixing in spring actually needed fixing now. She took him at his word. They finished the fence section. The sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the temperature dropped with it, the way it did in December out here. Not gradually, not gently, but decisively, as though the cold had been waiting just behind the light, and the moment the light went, it moved in. "Come inside," he said. "There's something on the stove." She followed him in. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and it smelled of whatever he'd had simmering since morning. Something with potatoes and salt pork, she thought. The same category of thing he tended to make in winter because it was warm and took no attention and was ready when you were. He moved around the kitchen with the particular ease of a man who had lived alone in a space long enough that his movements had organized themselves around it without his having to think about them, and she sat at the table, her usual chair, the one she'd been sitting in for 2 months without either of them having designated it as hers, and let the warmth of the room work on the cold in her hands. He set a bowl in front of her, sat down across the table with his own. "I'm going to write to my mother," she said, not quite out of nowhere. It was a thought that had been sitting at the edge of things for the last hour. "Tell her what actually happened. I wrote her before without... I left things out." "Mothers generally know when things are left out," Garrick said. "Mine definitely does." Eliza picked up her spoon. "She'll be annoyed that I didn't tell her sooner. Then she'll tell me she's glad I'm all right. In that order." "Sounds like a sensible woman." "She is. More sensible than I was about the whole situation." He looked at her over his bowl. "You trusted something that was presented to you as trustworthy," he said. "That's not the same as being foolish." She wanted to disagree with that, because the version of herself that had gotten on the train felt, from the inside, like it warranted some serious criticism. But she also understood that arguing the point wasn't going to accomplish anything that couldn't be better accomplished by simply not making the same kind of mistake again. "He was good at it," she said finally. "The letters were... he was good at it." "That says something about him," Garrick said. "Not about you." She ate. He ate. The stove worked at the cold in the room, and mostly won. Outside, the dark had fully arrived in the way it arrived in December in Montana, which was completely and without negotiation. She thought about the woman from Ohio that Mrs. Faber had mentioned 2 months ago, the one who'd stayed, who worked at the dressmaker's on 2nd Street. She had still not sought her out, though Mrs. Faber had offered to introduce them more than once. There had been a reason for that she hadn't quite examined, some avoidance of the company of someone who had been through the same thing, as though standing next to a mirror was worse than standing alone. Maybe she'd go on Monday. Maybe she'd find the woman and have coffee with her, and they would talk about something else entirely, and that would be enough. Just the fact of someone else who had stood on the same platform and made a different decision and built a different life from the pieces. There were worse things to know about a place than that it contained people who had survived the same thing you were surviving. She finished the bowl, set down the spoon, looked at the carved bird on the windowsill, which had been moved at some point to a slightly different position, facing more toward the room than it had before, which she chose not to think about too specifically. "I'll be in late tomorrow," she said. "I need to go to the post office in the morning, write the letter to my mother and one to the agency in Boston." "Take the morning," he said. "The books aren't going anywhere." She put on her coat. He went to get the wagon without being asked because it was late and dark and cold, and he had apparently, somewhere along the way, made a quiet private decision about driving her back to town that was no longer a point of discussion. On the road back, she watched the dark landscape move past and thought about the letter she was going to write in the morning. She thought about how to explain what had happened in language that was accurate without being catastrophic, that was honest without requiring her mother to board a train and come out here herself. She thought about the particular careful math of telling the truth to the people who cared about you, how much to give them and how much to keep, and how to know the difference. The wagon moved through the dark on the frozen road. The horses knew the way by now. She had not been entertainment. She was going to need to remember that on the days when the memory of the word felt loudest, she had been a person who had wanted something real and had been handed a forgery, and she had had the sense, eventually, to put the forgery down and pick up something that was actual and solid and would bear weight. She was still deciding what exactly that solid thing was, but she was, at minimum, deciding, which was more than she'd been able to say in October, standing on an empty platform in the cold. That was something. The lights of Red Creek appeared ahead of them, small and warm in the December dark, and Eliza held on to the side of the wagon seat and let the horses carry her the rest of the way in. The letter to the Boston agency went out on a Saturday morning, and the one to her mother went out the same day, and Eliza walked back from the post office feeling lighter in a way that was not quite relief and not quite resolution, but was something in the direction of both. She had written both letters with the same care she brought to the ranch ledgers, clearly, specifically, without excessive ornamentation. The agency letter had laid out what had happened in plain terms: the name, the method, the outcome, and the suggestion that the name Cornelius Aldridge be flagged in their records and investigated. She had not been dramatic about it. She had not needed to be. Her mother's letter had been harder to write, not because her mother would judge her. She wouldn't, not in the way that mattered, but because writing the full truth of it down meant seeing it fully herself. And there were still parts of the October version of herself she found difficult to look at directly. She had written it anyway. She had posted it before she could revise it into something less honest. By Monday, she was back at the ranch. The thing about December work on a cattle operation, she had come to understand, was that it was both relentless and repetitive in a way that the accounts were not. The accounts had problems that resolved once you solved them. The winter feeding schedule had problems that were the same problem every single day. The cattle needed feeding, the feed needed moving, the water needed checking for ice, and none of these tasks were improved by having been done yesterday. Garrick worked through them with a steadiness she found almost meditative to observe, the same way she found it settling to watch the horses move, something in the simple, ongoing commitment of it. She had started helping with some of the lighter physical work without quite planning to. It had begun with the water troughs in the second week of December, when she'd arrived early one morning and found him already out there breaking ice with a long-handled tool, and she had, without thinking about it much, taken the bucket he'd set down and started filling the secondary trough from the hand pump. He had looked over at her and said nothing, which she had taken as neither objection nor invitation, simply acknowledgement. After that, it had become part of the morning, 20 minutes of the practical work before she came inside to the books. She was not suited for the heavy labor, which was fine because there was plenty of labor that wasn't heavy and that nobody had been doing because one man, doing everything alone, could only prioritize so much. She organized the feed storage room, which had been functioning on an arrangement she suspected had been installed sometime before Margaret Hale passed and had not been reconsidered since. She tracked the consumption rates against what Garrick had estimated and found a discrepancy she could work into the spring purchasing projections. She sewed a split in a feed sack that had been leaking oats onto the barn floor for what appeared to be several weeks. "You don't have to do any of that," Garrick said, on the day he found her in the barn with a needle and a length of heavy thread, working on the feed sack with the slightly aggressive focus she brought to tasks she found annoying but necessary. "I know that," she said. "I mean, your job is the books. The books are in good shape." She pulled the thread through. This was bleeding money onto the floor. He was quiet for a moment. "It was," he admitted. "Then it needed doing." He did not argue further. She had noticed this about him. He generally only argued things once, if at all. He made his position clear and then he stepped back and let the other person decide, because he seemed to understand that continuing to press past the first statement was rarely how you changed anyone's mind and was mostly just how you irritated them. Her mother's reply came the third week of December, faster than she'd expected. The letter was characteristically direct. Her mother had written, "I knew something was wrong in October when you didn't describe the man once in 2 letters. I didn't say so because you had your mind made up, and I have learned, after 23 years, that telling you when your mind is made up is approximately as useful as arguing with the weather. I am glad you are safe. I am glad you have found work. Tell me about the man whose ranch it is." Eliza read that last sentence twice, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands, and then folded it and put it in her bag and said nothing about it to anyone. She wrote back describing the ranch's operations in some detail and the state of the winter feed stores and the way the mountains looked in the early morning when there was new snow on them. And she did not describe Garrick Hale at all, which she understood her mother would read as its own kind of description. Christmas arrived without much fanfare, the way it arrived in small frontier towns. Practically, with some extra food and a service at the church, and a small gathering at Mrs. Faber's boarding house that had been more pleasant than Eliza had expected. Mrs. Faber had made a molasses cake that was extraordinary. The schoolteacher, Miss Pratt, had drunk 2 glasses of cider and told a long, involved story about a student who had put a lizard in her desk drawer, which she seemed to have found more amusing in retrospect than at the time. Mr. Denny, the older man whose reasons for being in Red Creek remained obscure, had played a decent harmonica. Eliza had brought a bottle of something from the general store and had spent most of the evening listening more than talking, which suited her fine. She had discovered over these months someone who found large gatherings of even pleasant people mildly exhausting, and small ones tolerable, and 1 or 2 people at a time genuinely comfortable. Red Creek had mostly provided the latter, which suited her constitution. Garrick had not been at Mrs. Faber's. She had not expected him. She knew, from small accumulations of information, that he spent Christmas the same way he seemed to spend most things, doing what needed doing and not making a particular occasion of it. She had heard, secondhand through the circuitous route of small-town information, that he'd spent the last 2 Christmases alone at the ranch. She had not raised this with him directly. It was not her information to raise. She had, however, left a small package on the table the day before she'd come into town for Christmas. It was nothing elaborate. A good quality pen, the kind that held ink properly and didn't skip, which she had noticed his current one did, frequently and at inopportune moments. She had bought it at the general store without making any particular decision about it, the way you sometimes bought things when you were certain they were needed and happened to be in the right place to acquire them. When she came back after Christmas, the pen was on the table in the spot his old one had occupied. The old one was gone. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. She sat down and opened the ledger, and the day began. January was the coldest month. She had been warned about this by Mrs. Faber, by Miss Pratt, by the 2 mining surveyors who had departed in November, and by a general sense she'd gotten from anyone who had spent a winter in this part of Montana, which was that January was a different order of cold from anything that had preceded it. She had believed them intellectually, but there was a gap between believing something intellectually and knowing it in your bones at 7 in the morning when you were standing on a road with the temperature somewhere that her Massachusetts upbringing lacked the proper vocabulary for. She kept walking. She had good boots now. She'd bought them in December, replacing the city ones that had never been intended for this kind of work. And the new ones were heavy and plain and had been recommended by the man at the general store with the confidence of someone who had spent 20 years watching people learn that lesson the hard way. They were the best purchase she had made since arriving in Montana. Possibly one of the better purchases of her life. The creek road was completely frozen now. She walked it with the careful, weight-distributed step she'd developed after the fall in November, and she did not fall again, though there were mornings that required her full attention to the ground under her feet and left her slightly breathless with concentration by the time the ranch gate came into view. It was on one of those mornings, in the 2nd week of January, that she arrived to find Garrick already out by the gate rather than in the barn. He was standing with his arms folded, looking at something in the direction of the lower pasture, and his expression had the quality it had when something was wrong but not catastrophic, a contained alertness. "What is it?" she said. "3 head in the lower pasture didn't come up to the gate last night," he said. "Going to have to go down and look for them." "Stuck?" "Could be. Could be a section of fence I thought was solid." He looked at the sky, which was clear and pale and offered no particular comfort. "Going to be a few hours." "I'll start the books," she said. He looked at her. "Coffee's already on," he said. "I know where it is." He went. She went inside and poured her coffee and sat down at the table and opened the ledger to the January purchasing entries and began. The stove had been stoked already, and the kitchen was warm enough, and through the window above the table she could see the far pasture and, after a while, the small dark figure of Garrick moving along the fence line at the bottom of the slope. She worked for 2 hours, and then he came back with all 3 cattle accounted for and a section of fence that needed proper attention and his hands cold enough that he held them over the stove for a minute before he could properly flex them. She had a second cup of coffee waiting on the counter. He picked it up and drank half of it standing at the stove. Found them down by the creek bank. Section of fence gave way where the water eroded the post base. Should have checked it in November. Is it fixable now? Temporarily, properly fixed in spring. He sat down at the other end of the table. How's January looking? Tighter than December, she said. The feed rates are holding, but the projection for February is going to be close if the winter runs long. I want to go over the contingency numbers with you before the end of the month. All right, he said. He was looking at the page over his coffee cup. She had noticed he'd gotten better at reading the ledger over the past 2 months. Initially, the system had been something he trusted without quite following, but he'd been asking more specific questions lately, pointing at line items and saying, "What does this represent?" until he understood the full picture, not just the summary. She respected that. A man who wanted to understand his own accounts, rather than simply be told whether they were good or bad, was a man who was actually trying to run something. "You're good at this," he said, without preamble. She looked up. "The ledger?" "All of it," he said. "The books. The way you think about the operation. The feed storage." He paused. "The sewing up of things that are leaking." She was fairly sure she was not being talked about only in terms of the feed sack, but she let it stay in the register of the practical because that felt safer. "It's the same kind of thinking," she said. "Identifying where things are going wrong and correcting them before the loss gets larger." "I know," he said. "I'm not talking about the methodology." There was a pause then that was different from their usual pauses. She felt it, the specific texture of a conversation that had changed direction and was waiting to see whether either party would acknowledge the change or retreat back to safer ground. "Garrick," she said. "I know," he said quickly, and she realized he was not, in fact, ready to say the thing he'd been moving toward, and had pulled back, and was now looking at his coffee cup with the expression of someone who had arrived at a door and then decided they weren't prepared for what might be on the other side of it. She understood that. She was, in her own way, standing at the same door. She went back to the ledger. He refilled his cup and went out to check the barn. The rest of January passed in the way of the rest of January, cold and demanding and occupied, which was, she had decided, the best possible version of a Montana January. The alternative version, the one where she was sitting idle in a boarding house room with no money coming in and no clear plan forward, was easy enough to imagine and thoroughly unappealing. She had a plan now. Several of them, in fact. The kind of plans that were more like trajectories, directions she was moving in rather than fixed destinations. The accounting work, which she had come to think of as genuinely her work rather than temporary employment. The possibility of a teaching position, which Mr. Calloway from the school board had mentioned again in passing in January, in the careful way of a man who was hoping she might volunteer for something he didn't quite want to ask for directly. Her own developing familiarity with the town and the people in it, Mrs. Faber and Miss Pratt and the girl from Ohio, whose name was Clara and who worked at the dressmaker's, and who Eliza had finally gone to see in January and found to be exactly what Mrs. Faber had described, bright as a coin, and not interested in talking about what had brought her to Red Creek, and very good company for 2 hours over tea. She had a life here. That was the quiet, remarkable fact of it. She had come to Montana looking for someone else's life, someone else's vision of what her future should be, and had found instead the raw materials of one that was actually hers. It did not look like she had imagined. It was not warm in the way she'd pictured warmth. It was not easy. There was nothing in it that was particularly easy, come to think of it. Not the cold, not the work, not the social architecture of a small town where everyone knew your name and your business within about 3 weeks of your arrival. But it was real, and it was hers, and she had built it herself out of the wreckage of someone else's lie, which gave it a solidity that the imagined version had never actually had. February came. The contingency numbers were reviewed and found manageable. The fence repairs were planned for April. The feed supplier, Bickers, the one she'd flagged in November, had come down 4% on his rates after Garrick had the conversation she'd suggested, which was not the full 12% but was real money and had improved their position for the spring. She had entered it in the ledger with a satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal from herself. It was in the second week of February that things shifted. It was not a single moment, which was what she would have expected if she'd been expecting anything. It was not a dramatic scene or a declarative statement. It was an accumulation of small things, the way a river did not seem to be rising until suddenly the banks were wet. It was the Tuesday when she'd twisted her ankle on the ice patch at the end of the ranch driveway. Genuinely twisted it. Not badly, but enough that she'd sat down on the porch step and said something under her breath that she wouldn't have said around anyone she was trying to impress. And he'd heard from inside and come out and crouched down in the snow in front of her without making any kind of production of it, and just looked at the ankle with the same matter-of-fact attention he brought to fence posts and livestock and said, "Can you put weight on it?" And when she said yes, had offered his hand to help her up, and had not let go of her arm until they were inside and she was sitting down, and she had noticed, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not wanted him to. It was the Friday she'd been working late, later than usual, deep in the February projections, and had looked up from the ledger to find it was past 5 and fully dark outside, and had said, without thinking about it, "I lost track of time." And he had looked up from the newspaper at the other end of the table and said, "I figured." And she had realized he'd stayed in the kitchen while she worked, reading the week-old paper for approximately 2 hours longer than he'd needed to, and had not once mentioned that it was late. It was the morning she'd come in out of a particularly brutal February wind, and he'd taken her coat from her and hung it on the hook near the stove so it would warm up before she had to put it back on, and had done it with the complete absence of ceremony that made it somehow more significant than a gesture that announced itself would have been. Small things. An accumulation. She was reviewing the spring livestock projections on a Thursday afternoon when he came in from the barn and stood in the doorway for a moment, not moving, and she looked up because she could feel him standing there in the way you felt things you weren't looking at when your attention had gotten trained on them over months. "I need to say something," he said. His voice was in its quietest register, which she knew by now to mean the thing behind it was serious. "All right," she said. She closed the ledger. He came in fully. He did not sit down. He stood at the counter with his hands on it, not leaning, just placed there, like he needed the solidity of it. He was looking at a point somewhere above the table, not at her, which was unusual enough that she noticed it immediately. Garrick Hale generally looked directly at the thing he was dealing with. "This ranch was a different place before October," he said. She waited. "I don't mean the books," he said. "I mean the—" He stopped. He was clearly working out how to say the precise thing rather than settling for an approximate version. She had, over months, come to understand that this was what his pauses meant. Not that he had nothing to say, but that he was insisting on saying the right thing rather than the available thing. "I was running it," he said finally. "I was taking care of it. But there's a difference between taking care of something and it actually being alive, functioning, like a place that's meant to have people in it." She was very still. "You came in here and you fixed the accounts," he said. "And you fixed the storage room and you sewed up what was leaking and you told me to talk to Bickers, which I should have done 2 years ago." He paused. "And none of those things are the thing I'm trying to say." "What's the thing you're trying to say?" she said. He finally looked at her, the full direct attention she'd gotten used to, the kind that didn't look away when the thing it was looking at was complicated. "That I don't know what this ranch looks like without you in it anymore," he said. "And I've tried to figure out whether that's something I should keep to myself. And I've come to the conclusion that keeping it to myself it's not honest. And I don't want to be the kind of man who keeps things because they're convenient to keep." The kitchen was very quiet. The stove made its small sounds. "Garrick," she said, "I know you came here because someone lied to you," he said. "I know that's not a small thing. I know what I'm saying is, it's a complicated thing to hear, given how you got here. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm not asking you for anything except—" He stopped. "I just needed you to know. That's the whole of it. I needed it said." She looked at him for a long moment. There was a version of herself, the October version, the one who had clutched letters to her chest on a train, who would have heard this and felt it in a way that was too large, too fast, too tangled up with wanting it to be the answer to everything. That version would have leaned into it immediately because she was lonely and uncertain, and the words were beautiful in the way that beautiful words had been dangerous before. But she was not that version anymore. She was the February version, the one with good boots and a well-organized feed room and 3.5 months of watching a man actually do what he said he would do, every single day, without announcement. You didn't promise me anything, she said. No, he said. In all this time. You didn't once tell me something was going to be a certain way and then not make it that way. He thought about it. There was the fence section I told you was fine until spring, he said. You corrected that yourself, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, barely, in the way that was as close as he usually got to something you'd call a smile. She stood up from the table. She did not move toward him, not yet, because she was not that impulsive, and they were both people who needed things to be said plainly before they were acted on. I'm not the same person I was on that platform, she said. Whatever I felt about coming here, whatever I thought was waiting for me, I'm not that person anymore. And what I'm telling you is that the person I am now... She paused because she wanted to say this accurately. What I'm telling you is that I've noticed everything, she said. I notice all of it, all the small things. I've been noticing them for months. He was very still. I'm not ready for large gestures, she said. I don't trust large gestures at the moment, which I think is reasonable. It is, he said, but I trust this, she said. She gestured slightly at the room, the table, the ledger, the window where the carved bird sat. I trust what this actually is. I know what this is because I've been watching it be what it is every day for 4 months. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention she had never found in anyone else. Not watchfulness, which was different, not analysis, but something that felt more like recognition. The way you looked at something you had been trying to name for a long time and had finally found the right word for. What is it? He said quietly. Something real, she said. Something that holds weight. He reached across the corner of the table, not dramatically, not rushing, and put his hand over hers where it rested on the closed ledger. His hand was rough and large and warm from being near the stove, and he did not squeeze or grip, just placed it there, the way he placed most things, with intention and without excess. She turned her hand over under his. They stayed like that for a moment. Outside, the February wind was doing what it did, which was insist. The mountains were doing what they did, which was exist without caring about any of this. The stove ticked. I should finish the projections, she said finally. You should, he agreed. He did not move his hand immediately. She did not move hers. Garrick, she said. Yeah. The spring feed purchase needs to go out by March 15th or we'll miss the better rate. He exhaled through his nose in the way that was, she had come to understand, his version of a laugh when something amused him that he hadn't expected. He moved his hand. She opened the ledger. He went to the stove and refilled both their cups and set hers at her elbow and sat down at the other end of the table and picked up the newspaper. And none of that was different from any other afternoon except that it was entirely different from every other afternoon. She wrote a number in the column. The pen, the good one, the one she'd given him at Christmas, moved smoothly across the page without skipping. Outside, the afternoon light had the particular quality it had in February when the season was just beginning, tentatively and without commitment, to consider the possibility of not being winter forever. The snow on the distant peaks was the same. The cold was the same. But the light was doing something slightly different than it had been doing in December. Something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite promise, but was in that general direction. She wrote another number. She heard him turn a page. The ranch was quiet around them in the way that things were quiet when they were full. He asked her in March, not with ceremony, not with the kind of staged production she had read about in the novels that circulated through Mrs. Faber's boarding house, passed from border to border until the covers were soft and the pages had other people's margin notes in them. There was no candlelight, no rehearsed speech, no moment designed to be remembered in a particular way. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the temperature had risen just enough above freezing to make the yard a study in mud, and she had come in from checking the feed storage with her boots thoroughly ruined and her arithmetic on the spring grain order completed in her head, and he was at the stove making coffee as he always was, and he turned around when she came in and said without preamble, I want you to stay. Not through March, not through spring, permanently. She set the grain order figures down on the table, looked at him. As your wife, he said, because he was Garrick Hale, and he did not leave important things implicit. She had known this was coming, had known it since February, since the afternoon of the ledger and his hand over hers, had felt the shape of it approaching the way you felt weather approaching in this country, with your whole body before your mind caught up. She had thought about how she would answer. She had turned the question over during the cold mornings on the creek road, had examined it from the angles she examined everything, had asked herself the hard questions a woman had to ask when she was considering building a life with a person she had known for 5 months. What she had found each time was this. She did not feel certain the way she had felt certain about the letters. That old certainty had been a kind of fever, warm and consuming and disconnected from anything real. What she felt about Garrick Hale was different. It was quieter. It had texture. It had specific memories attached to it. The fence work in December, the hand over the coffee cup on the morning she'd twisted her ankle, the way he'd opened the box from Margaret's year without making her witness to anything she hadn't been invited to witness. It was not a feeling she could have described in 4 pages of correspondence to someone who had never met either of them. It was the kind of feeling that only existed in context, that had been built out of actual days and actual conversations, and the actual accumulation of a man doing what he said he would do until doing what he said he would do was simply what he was. That was, she had decided, more trustworthy than certainty. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to know. The small recalibration, the thing that happened in his face when he was actually receiving something rather than just hearing it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He turned back to the stove and poured the coffee, and she sat down and picked up her grain order figures, and that was more or less that. It was not a scene anyone would have written in a novel. It did not look like the pictures in her head from the train journey in October, the ones where everything had soft edges and a kind of golden inevitability to it. It was 2 people in a muddy-seasoned kitchen deciding to do a practical and serious thing together, and it was, she thought, exactly right for what it actually was. She wrote to her mother that evening. This letter was easier than the previous ones. Her mother's reply, when it came 2 weeks later, said, "I want to meet him before the summer is out. Don't tell me I can't make the trip. I've made longer ones for worse reasons." Eliza read that letter at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, because she had moved into the ranch house at the end of March, into the room on the east side that did in fact have a window that caught the morning light in a way that felt almost apologetic, exactly as someone had once described to her in a letter she'd spent 8 months believing and half a year trying to stop thinking about. The irony of it was not lost on her. She had sat in that room on the first morning, light coming through the glass and laying itself across the floor in long, pale strips, and had thought about that letter and about the man who wrote it, and had made herself think about it fully rather than skirt around it the way she sometimes still did. She had decided, sitting in that light, that she was going to let it be what it was. A forgery. A skilled, specific, ultimately hollow reproduction of something real. She was going to stop checking the memory of those letters for the place where she should have known, because she'd done that enough times now to understand that there was no such place, that the lie had been well constructed, and that the lesson was not you should have seen it, but something more difficult and more useful. You survived it, and you know now what real looks like because you are living in it. That was the harder lesson, the one that required her to be generous to herself in a way that did not come naturally. She was working on it. The wedding was in April, after the mud had mostly resolved itself, and the creek was running loud and fast with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along the road were doing something tentative with green. It was not a large event. Eliza had not wanted large, had felt, given the nature of how she'd arrived in Red Creek, and what everyone in the town knew about how she'd arrived, that a large wedding would have a quality of performance to it that she found unappealing. What she wanted was a thing that was true, and truth did not require an audience. What they had was the justice of the peace, whose name was Mr. Aberfoyle, and who was a small, neat man with a pocket watch he consulted twice during the ceremony for reasons that remained unclear. They had Mrs. Faber, who wore a hat Eliza had never seen before, and who cried during the vows in the brisk, non-sentimental way of someone who had been ambushed by emotion and was annoyed about it. They had Miss Pratt, who had brought flowers she'd dried herself because nothing fresh was growing yet. They had Clara, the girl from Ohio, who worked at the dressmaker's, who had become over the winter the closest thing Eliza had to a friend of her own making in this town. Not because they'd talked much about the thing that connected them, but because they'd talked about everything else, and because Clara had a kind of dry, steady humor that Eliza found restorative. They had Mr. Calloway from the school board, who had finally formally offered Eliza the teaching position in January, and who had looked visibly relieved when she'd accepted part-time hours, because the school board had apparently been trying to solve this particular problem for 6 months, and had developed a fatalistic relationship with the possibility of it. And they had Garrick, who wore a clean shirt she'd not seen before, and stood next to her in front of Mr. Aberfoyle with his hands at his sides, and said what he was asked to say with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at her rather than at the justice of the peace or the small gathering behind them. When Mr. Aberfoyle said, "You may," Garrick kissed her before he finished the sentence, which was the only impractical thing she could remember him doing in the 5 months she'd known him, and which consequently meant more to her than a great deal of practical things had. Mrs. Faber had made a cake. It was not as good as the Christmas molasses cake, but it was made with intention, which counted. Her mother came in June. Eleanor Hartwell arrived on the 11:45. The same train, the same platform, the same weathered pine boards, and the same station master with his underperforming mustache. Eliza was there to meet her, which meant that the platform was not empty, which meant that the meeting that the platform had failed to provide in October was finally, in its way, provided now with the right person. Her mother was 51 and looked 51, gray at her temples and lines around her eyes, and the posture of someone who had carried things for a long time and had stopped apologizing for what it had done to her back. She stepped off the train and looked at Eliza for a long moment, the way she always looked at her after a separation, taking a full accounting before she allowed herself to be satisfied. "You look different," her mother said. "I'm the same," Eliza said. "You're not," her mother said, and hugged her. They stood on the platform for a moment, and Eliza did not think about October, or she tried not to, and mostly succeeded. The mountains were there in the distance the way they always were. The morning was clear and cold in the way that June mornings still were in Montana, the cold retreating slowly and incompletely, as though it hadn't fully committed to leaving. Garrick had brought the wagon. He was waiting at the end of the platform with his hat in his hands, which was, she understood, his version of a formal gesture. He and her mother looked at each other with the mutual assessment of two people who had formed opinions of each other from letters written by a third party and were now engaged in the process of checking those opinions against reality. "Mr. Hale," her mother said. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "My daughter tells me the books were in a terrible state when she arrived." "They were," he said. "She also tells me they're in good shape now." "They are," he said. Her mother looked at him for another moment. "Good," she said, and got into the wagon with a decisiveness that indicated she'd made up her mind about something and was done with the preliminary stage. Garrick helped her mother up and then looked at Eliza over his shoulder with the expression she knew as his version of that, when all right, and she looked back at him with what she hoped conveyed, "She likes you. That's just how she is." And they drove back to the ranch in the early June morning. Her mother stayed 3 weeks. She had opinions about the organization of the kitchen, which she delivered directly and which Eliza mostly agreed with. She had questions about the livestock operation that she put to Garrick, with the focused curiosity of someone who had always wanted to understand how things worked and had never had occasion to learn about cattle. She walked the creek road twice, in both directions, and reported that it was a better road than it looked from the wagon. On the second-to-last evening of her visit, Eliza's mother sat with her on the porch in the long summer evening while Garrick was out checking the far fence and said, "You made the right decision, staying." "I know," Eliza said. "I don't mean the marriage." Her mother was looking at the mountains in the way she had been looking at them all week, with the slightly reluctant appreciation of a Boston woman who had not expected to find them so affecting. "I mean, staying. Not going back east after what happened. Not folding." Eliza looked at the creek, which was loud with early summer water. "I thought about it," she said honestly. "In October, I thought about it very specifically." "I know you did," her mother said. "I could tell in the letters, the careful ones." "I didn't fold because there was nothing to go back to that was better than figuring this out," Eliza said. "It sounds accurate," her mother said. They sat for a while. The evening was doing what evenings did in Montana in June, taking a long time to end, the light refusing to concede, staying low and golden along the ridgeline past 8 o'clock. "He's a good man," her mother said. Not as a question. "He is," Eliza said. He's not, he doesn't say things he doesn't mean, ever, which sounds like a small thing, but it is not a small thing. Her mother looked at her sideways. No, she said, it's not a small thing at all. Garrick came back from the fence line as the light was finally failing, and he came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair without being asked, because by now that was how things worked, and her mother passed him the cup of something she'd been holding that he accepted without comment, and the three of them sat on the porch while the valley went dark around them in degrees, the mountains keeping their outline long after everything else had dissolved. Her mother left on a Tuesday. She hugged Eliza at the train platform with the specific compression of someone trying to communicate something that didn't have words, and shook Garrick's hand with both of hers, which was not something Eliza had seen her mother do before. She got on the train and did not look back through the window, which was a quality Eliza recognized as her own. She and Garrick drove back to the ranch in the July morning, and the road was dusty now, completely different from the frozen surface she'd learned to navigate in her first Montana winter. And General moved at his customary pace, and the creek was lower, and the cottonwoods were full and heavy and green. She approved, Garrick said. She didn't disapprove, Eliza said. For my mother, that's the same thing. Good enough, he said. She taught school 3 days a week through the fall and found that Miss Pratt had been right. It was mostly organization and patience and the willingness to repeat yourself. She was adequate at 2 of those things and working on the third. The children were unpredictable in the way of all children, by turns infuriating and oddly affecting, and she came home from teaching days with a different kind of tiredness than she came home from accounting days, less cerebral and more fundamental, as though the work had used parts of her that didn't usually get used. She kept the ranch books. She always kept the ranch books. That did not change. What changed was smaller and larger at the same time, the way the house began to carry the evidence of 2 people living in it rather than one. The way certain habits became shared without discussion. The way she stopped thinking of the kitchen window as the one she'd been promised in a letter and started thinking of it simply as the window. Her window. The one that she knew so well by December of her first full year that she didn't have to look at it to tell you what the morning was doing outside. The winter of her first full year was harder than the previous one, which everyone told her was unusual, that last winter had been bad, but this was worse. There was a week in January when the temperature dropped to something she could not find a practical attitude toward, and 2 of the cattle were lost to it despite everything. And there was a stretch of 4 days where the road was impassable, and she and Garrick were alone at the ranch with the stove going full time, and the wind doing what January winds did in Montana, which was take the whole situation personally. On the 3rd day of that stretch, when the wind had been at the windows since before dawn, and the temperature had not risen above its lowest point since the previous week, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the lamp and watched Garrick come in from checking the barn, frost on his coat and his beard, and his hands taking their 2 minutes over the stove to come back to working temperature. She thought about the platform in October, the cold, the bench, the $14. She thought about the very specific shape of despair she had felt on that bench, and how completely she had not been able to see past it to anything. "We lost another one?" she asked, because his face told her. "The old red one," he said. "Found her in the corner of the shelter. She was already... It was quick, I think. Temperature this low." He poured his coffee. "Could have been worse." "Could have," she said. He sat down. He did not try to make it better than it was, which was one of the things she trusted about him. His refusal to coat things. 2 cattle gone in a bad winter. That was a loss. He recorded it alongside the other losses, and you kept going. "Spring order's going to need adjusting," she said. "I know." He looked at the ledger she had open. "You already working on it?" "Started this morning," she said. He put his hand on the table. She put hers over it. They stayed like that for a moment in the cold kitchen with the wind at the glass. This was not the life she had imagined on the train in October. She understood that clearly enough to say it plainly, even to herself. The imagined life had been softer, had been someone else's blueprint, had been built on language that turned out to have no foundation under it. This life, the cold and the loss and the mud-seasoned boots and the ledger by lamplight and the hand under hers on the kitchen table, this was not that. This required more of her. It asked for things she hadn't known she had until it asked for them. But it was real. It held weight. When she put her hand on it, it did not give way. She had learned, over 14 months in Montana, that this was the only thing worth building on. Not a promise, not someone's portrait of a future design to be believed, just the actual, difficult, non-optional reality of what was in front of you. And the decision, made again every morning, to face it and build something from it that was yours. Years later, enough years that the children were old enough to have opinions, and the ranch had grown into something that required 2 hired hands through the summer, and the ledger had been updated twice into a new system she'd developed as the operation expanded. She would sometimes try to explain this to people who asked how she'd ended up in Montana. It was a question that came up because people could see, looking at her, that she had not been born to this. She carried herself like someone who had arrived, not like someone who had always been there. She spoke with the slight precision of a woman who had learned this language as an adult, rather than grown up inside it. What she told them, generally, was that she had come looking for one life and found herself building a different one. People seemed to find that satisfying, and it was also true. And it left out the parts that were not her story alone to tell. What she didn't usually say, what she kept closer, because it was the part that mattered most and was therefore the part she was most careful with, but was this: that the worst thing that had ever happened to her had been a lie someone told her, and that the lie had done everything a lie does. It had cost her money, cost her time, cost her dignity in a way she still occasionally felt when she thought about it at 2 a.m, which happened less frequently now, but had not stopped entirely. The lie had been real, and the damage had been real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But the lie had also put her on a platform in Red Creek, Montana in October, and had left her there, and she had had to decide what to do next. And what she had decided, not heroically, not with any particular grace, mostly just because there was no viable alternative, was to stay and work and watch what was actually around her, rather than what she had been promised was around her. That distinction between what was promised and what was actual was the thing she had learned. It was the only thing she had learned, really, though it had taken her years to understand how complete a lesson it was. You couldn't build a life on a promise. You could only build it on what was real, what was present, what you could put your hands on and find solid. Everything else was just words on paper. The kitchen window faced east. In the winter, the light came through it low and pale and long, laying itself across the table and the ledger and whatever she had left out from the night before. In summer, it came in early and warm and changed the whole character of the room by 7 a.m. She had been watching it do this for several years now, and she had not gotten tired of it, which she took as information about something. Some mornings, the clear ones, the ones where the night had been cold enough to leave frost on the glass that the sun melted from the outside in, she stood at that window with her coffee and watched the mountains come into the light, the way they did it differently every morning, depending on the angle and the season and the weather that was either arriving or leaving. She had never once woken up to those mountains and found them exactly the same as the day before. This morning was like that: the frost, the light, the mountains doing something new with both. Behind her, she heard Garrett come in from the barn, heard the familiar weight of his steps on the porch and the specific sound of the door, heard him go to the stove without having to look. "Cold out," he said. "I know," she said. "I checked the trough at 6. "Ice?" "1/4 inch. I broke it." A pause. The sound of coffee being poured. "You didn't have to do that." "I was already up," she said. She turned from the window. He was standing at the stove with his cup, looking at her with the same attention he had always had, the kind that didn't diminish with familiarity, that had not been used up by proximity. Some things worked that way. Some things were not reduced by knowing them better. She had found that surprising, in the early days, and had eventually stopped being surprised by it and had simply accepted it as one of the facts of this particular life, the way you accepted the mountains and the winters and the east-facing window. The children were still asleep. The ranch was quiet in the particular way it was quiet before 7, occupied, full of its own ongoing life, but not yet loud with it. "Eliza," he said, "Spring order needs to go out this week if we want the better rate." She almost smiled. "I know," she said. "I sent it yesterday." He looked at her. "Yesterday? Before you told me?" He shook his head, not in frustration, but in the way of someone who had been consistently and cheerfully outpaced by another person for long enough that they had made a kind of peace with it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She turned back to the window. The mountains were still there. The light was doing something new. She drank her coffee and watched it, and did not need it to be anything other than what it was.